Well, good morning. Just want you to know, Jason and Brian wanted me to let you know that they are okay. And that was quite an encouragement to me. So, as I get into this morning, hey, I'm a grateful believer in Jesus Christ, celebrating 5.5 years of freedom from habitual lifestyle of fantasy and sexual addiction. My name's Burl. CR does that to you. Hi, Burl. Glad you're here. You know that there. Oh, well, never mind. Well, it's my turn to unmask. This is hard. It's hard for Denise, but I'm willing to do this because I don't want to see any of you live in the kind of bondage that I was subject to for so long. Hurts, habits, hang-ups, hypocrisies, and secrecies are killing our marriages today and keeping us from developing the relationship with God we deeply desire. What you're going to hear is what I learned from the fourth step of recovery, 12 Christ-centered steps based on the Beatitudes from Matthew 5. My story begins in a Christian home. I was the oldest of 3 children, born within 3 years of each other. That's our family, my dad and my sister Rita. That's me in the middle. Aren't they cute? Oh, well. Mom, Mabel over on the right, and then my little brother Jack. My brother and sister are both outgoing individuals, but I was always kind of reserved and shy. So that's a picture of us a few years ago when I got them all here. Love each one of them. We moved here in 1957 and became members of Immanuel Baptist Church, that this was before we turned it into Cross Community. I became a minister of music here in 1980 and remained in that position until 2010, 30 years. Dad was a deacon here in this church and set an example for us kids of working hard in order to provide for the family. He made sure we didn't sass Mom, and they both made sure that we got plenty of church. In fact, like many kids in the late 50s, I became a Christian out of fear of going to hell. But it was genuine. God looked after me all those years. Our family looked on the outside like a got-it-all-together family. Yet there were subtle little issues, but we didn't know there were any problems. We just assumed everyone lived that way. People tend to assume their childhood environment is the norm, and we were no different. For one, Mom and Dad just didn't talk much to us or each other. I do remember Mom reading us Bible stories when we were little and making us say our prayers every night, but it seemed the only time there was ever any serious emotional interaction was when one of us kids got in trouble. So basically, our family was just kind of roommates. I also don't remember seeing Mom and Dad affectionate toward each other at all, or us for that matter, verbally or physically. I never heard, "I love you," never heard, "that a boy," or never heard, "you did a good job," anything like that ever. This on-the-job home training in relationships resulted in the idea that saying or showing affection to anyone was silly, unneeded, and for sure not manly. I thought that was just movie or television stuff, yet those early TV shows embedded in me an unspoken craving for love and affection. Now, I was a bright and imaginative little guy, and like most kids, I would daydream about being an astronaut or being a great baseball player or even Superman. Yeah, I was one of those kids that put a towel around his neck and clothespinned it and jumped off the couch, see if I can fly. Any of that kind of thing, but oh well. But looking back, it's obvious to me now that Satan was not at all happy with my early salvation experience. He used my home life and that creative imagination to lure me almost immediately into a lifelong fantasy addiction. I began fantasizing about being in a different family with a TV sitcom set of parents. I'd spend hours alone, mentally pretending an entire story. It felt good. I felt loved and accepted in those fantasy homes. Wow, there I was, a 6-year-old, addicted to fantasizing, an addiction lasting nearly 60 years. Like most addictions, fantasy was a two-edged sword. Even though it brought relief from rejections, it also isolated me from people and froze me relationally at an emotional age of about 10. Most of my adult life has been spent relating to people like a young teenager would. Even in recent months, there have been a few panic situations where I felt like a small child who didn't know what to do. About the same time, I also began a very bad habit. One day, at the skillful age of 6, I threw a baseball and went through the bathroom window. Now, I was led to believe from Mom and from Sunday school that if we told the truth, things would be all right. So when Dad got home, I told him I broke the window. Well, I got a spanking anyway. Of course, I realize now that they didn't have much money, and he knew he was going to have to pay the landlord for that window. So he probably just took his frustration out on me. Now, understand I have nothing against spanking, but we were usually spanked out of anger, leaving us with the impression that we were a bother or an inconvenience. There was never any discussion afterwards as to what we should have done. We were only left to ourselves to try and figure that out. As a result of this and similar incidents, I began to form a terrible habit: lying. Lying to avoid trouble, lying to avoid embarrassment or rejection, and later lying to cover up my addictions. It has only been the last few years that I've learned lying is a huge problem with any addiction. In fact, for me, little white lies became automatic. The Christianity I grew up with made me feel that I had to be perfect, especially on the outside. So when I lied, I had to cover my tracks. I couldn't afford for someone to think me Christianly imperfect. This might all have been avoided if dads in those days would have known how to discuss the importance of it being okay to not be okay. Teachers and coaches were good about making me feel good about myself, but they were no substitute for Dad's acceptance. You know, in Jesus' case, no matter how people made him feel loved and accepted, every once in a while the Father would tell him out loud, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." God knew how important it was as a father to validate his son. Man, I sure could have used some validation. In the second grade, especially, when Dad brought me back to school one day after lunch. The guys were on the playground playing baseball. I asked him to hang around and watch me bat. When it was my turn, I struck out. In tears, I looked up and saw Dad drive off without a wave or a word. Just drove off. I was devastated. My little second grade mind could only decide that that driving off meant he was embarrassed and ashamed of me. Maybe that was true, maybe not. But the incident was never discussed. Obviously, though, I never forgot it. Remember this picture from a few Sundays ago? Little Owen, on his bat, and Brian was talking about that. I really thought Brian, when he put that picture up there, was fixing to tell that story I just told you. But listen, dads, Brian did it right in that situation. He made sure Owen knew he meant more to Brian than baseball. But in our family, we just didn't discuss anything. That baseball incident and other similar ones made me feel more shameful and drove me deeper into my little fantasy world. And in the real world, I slowly began to feel that I didn't fit in. When people got too close to me emotionally, I would start pulling away and avoiding them. Later, I realized that Dad, and especially Mom, did the same thing. Now, in our family, we each had friends, but really we avoided any kind of close or intimate relationship. Another incident that helped drive me further away from people happened in third grade. I remember excitedly raising my hand to answer the question, "What is the largest county in Oklahoma?" I said, LaFleur. Teacher said I was wrong. I said, well, that's what my daddy said. Boy, was I embarrassed. Subconsciously, I felt my family was lowlife. I was ashamed of us, ashamed of me. I never, ever volunteered to answer another question for the rest of my school days, through junior high, high school, and college, ever again. In fact, even today, when an authority figure asks for my opinion, it can send me into a panic because of the possible embarrassment of not getting it right. Now, Mom and Dad were also what we call enablers. Instead of being patient and working with us, helping us learn to do things, they would just say, oh, never mind, and then just do it themselves. Even though I picked up this same hang-up, my little mind in those days also interpreted their actions as love. I became what I call an enablee. If someone did stuff for me all the time, then that meant they loved me. When they quit doing stuff for me, then they didn't love me anymore. I really didn't learn sharing, serving, or gratitude at all. The example of love that I picked up from them was Dad working hard to provide for the family, fixing stuff, and keeping us kids in line. For Mom, it was keeping meals on the table and cleaning up after us. Now that I've been through quite a bit of recovery counseling, the Lord has led me to realize Mom and Dad were not to blame. Please understand that I always loved my parents, still love my parents. They're with the Lord today, and I miss them very much. But hey, we all blow it as parents, probably more than we know. They just raised us the way they were raised. No way were they intentionally trying to hurt us. Well, in my junior high years, like any good American male, I discovered girls. I remember somewhere around the 7th or 8th grade, everything us guys did was to try to impress and capture the attention of girls. For me, I made good grades, earned that prestigious football letter jacket, and tried to be a good Christian guy. I also taught myself to sing and play the guitar. After all, girls went crazy over the Beatles, you know. Yeah, I was probably about 19 there, still playing bass. That's me on the right, by the way, with the darker hair, you know. Anyhow, where was I? I think I got the crazy idea from TV and movies that girls just swarmed all over talented, nice guys. But you know, no one told me that I would have to talk if I actually caught me a girl. My addiction emotionally handicapped me from being able to relate to girls, or anybody for that matter. And it was at that point that the fantasy world got worse. I think I was about 8 or 9 years old when I saw a nude woman for the first time. That image was forever burned in my mind and awakened a hunger that from then on I constantly tried to satisfy, especially when later combined with fantasy and the education that I received from the 8th grade football locker room. Thus began a long 50-year battle with sexual addiction. This really became a huge problem in my college years when I got serious about Jesus. Reading my Bible every day got me started acting very Christianly. I guess subconsciously I thought doing enough good Christian stuff might somehow balance out those bad habits and God would be more pleased with me. But no matter what I did, the guilt and addictions remained. I remember praying many times, God, take it away. God, forgive me. God, help me. By the time I graduated college, I had become even more ashamed and withdrawn, avoiding relationships, subconsciously hoping no one would discover the real me. As the years passed, I had a terrible time believing I was even saved. I just couldn't be perfect. I became scared of God. A passage that haunted me was Matthew 23:27-28 that says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! On the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you're full of hypocrisy and wickedness." Man, I thought God saw me as one of those guys. In my religiousness, passages such as this led me to believe I was doomed for hell if I didn't straighten up, and that was regardless of my once saved, always saved upbringing. Because of my background, I really had no basis for comprehending our Father's unconditional love. Like TV shows, I assumed genuine, unconditional love was only a fantasy. I thought love was some kind of toleration. You know, I tolerate you, you tolerate me. Well, I brought all this baggage into marriage, and I was very disillusioned to have thought the sexual issues would disappear once I got married. My emotional immaturity quickly stagnated our relationship. Looking back, I can see that just within a few months of getting married, it was natural for me to avoid my wife's attempts for deeper emotional connection, and that I now know that women need as well as men. I didn't understand it. I was totally unprepared for it, and in fact, thought the attempt silly and unnecessary. I just thought she needed to grow up. Over the years, she tried in many different ways to break that barrier, but finally just gave up and put up her own wall. And like I was used to growing up, we just became roommates, tolerating each other. But to me, this was comfortable and normal. I honestly didn't think there was a problem. I think God tried many ways to help me overcome the avoiding problem. One was the blessing of 3 wonderful daughters. Turns out, in spite of my addictions, I was a pretty good dad. In fact, I guess the only unconditional love I had ever believed real came from them. Sabrina, Gwen, and Alicia. They all have different last names now, but they're mine, okay? And love them dearly. You see, watching my parents, I assumed people had some kind of ulterior motive if they showed me any kind of affection or acceptance. But my daughters, hey, they loved me for who I was. No strings attached. And they still do. They were definitely a lesson from God as to what love really was. But my addictions just wouldn't let me transfer that lesson over to other relationships. I tried on my own so many times to stop the sexual addiction cycle. I read lots of self-help books, but nothing worked for any extended period of time. It was finally in the summer of 2009 when our praise team went to a conference in Colorado that I heard a man speak to all the music ministers about sexual addiction and how, if statistics held true, the majority of the men in that room would fall to sexual issues within the 5 years that followed. I remember smugly thinking, that'll never happen to me. So blind was I to my own heart. Jeremiah 17:9 says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it?" 6 months later, I found myself alone, weeping in despair because I knew 30 years of marriage was over. I cried out to God, asking Him to spare us, to spare my family. I couldn't understand how He could let this happen. It seemed His reputation was at stake. After all, it wasn't my problem, just between me and Him. To be honest, though, I was crying out for God to spare me. I didn't want the embarrassment of divorce. I was a 40-year Baptist music minister. I had a good reputation. My pride wouldn't let me entertain the thought of being rejected and labeled by others as one of those people. Well, a few months later, I made a trip to Colorado Springs and began 12-step recovery work for sexual addiction through the ministry of the man I heard speak at that worship conference. But for the next year, I struggled with the program. My sobriety was sporadic at best. I couldn't seem to make any progress. Why? Well, looking back, it was partly because I was still convinced my secret life hurt only myself and no one else. And I was also very academic. Like I always did in school, I figured filling in the blanks and answering the questions would somehow fix everything. It wasn't until I got the letter that said the divorce was final that God finally began to get my attention. I went into shock, deep depression that lasted several months. Why had this 12-step program not worked? God, what are you trying to do to me? I began playing the blame game, believing it to ultimately be all God's fault. During this depression, I gained about 50 pounds or more, just sitting around eating and watching TV. I didn't want to do anything, didn't want to see anybody. I was humiliated. I felt like a failure. Everything I'd worked for, all my envisioned Christian future was gone. My doubts, guilt, and fears were huge. And to top it all off, the addictions just got worse and out of control. But God was still working. He hadn't forgotten me. He used that time to wake me up. I began seeing a family of origins counselor in Tulsa every week for several months. I also began to seriously work the steps over again and discovered that the real enemy was the fantasy world that I'd clung to for so long. Slowly, I began to see that God was not the cause of my problems. I began to see if there was any good happening in my life, it was God. If there was any bad, then it was either Satan or my own dumb fault. Romans 8:28 teaches us that God orchestrates and fits all the pieces, good and bad, together for His ultimate good. No hurt, no pain, no trauma is ever wasted with God. He uses them all for the good of others. Of the 12 steps, step 3 in recovery has been the hardest for me. In fact, I still struggle with it. It says we made a decision to turn our lives and our wills over to the care of God. This kind of goes along with the come step of cross community. Jesus said in Matthew 11:20-29, He said, "Come unto me, all you who are weary and burdened, and you will find rest for your souls." My upbringing taught me to trust myself, figure things out on my own. I didn't know that God wanted to be personally, hands-on, involved in my life. I thought He just kind of wound the universe up, walked off, and left it running. Since being in Celebrate Recovery, God has been teaching me to trust people and Him. He has led me out of my shell to share my secrets, and surprisingly to me, it has been through this type of sharing that the power of the fantasy world and sexual addiction was finally broken. Step 5 in recovery says we admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. This has to do with the growth step in cross community. You know, I've confessed my sins to God since I was a little boy, but to confess to others, that's only recent. James 5:16 tells us to confess our sins to one another and pray for one another that we may be healed. One of the main lessons I've learned in all this is that secrets kill, secrets destroy. That's why recovery works. Once a secret is out, it loses its power. You know, I knew my life was different and that Jesus had changed me soon after Denise and I had met. We only had a couple of dates before I told her my whole story, something I never could have imagined doing with anyone that I wanted to impress. But I trusted God, took a risk, and told her everything. I wanted it all on the table, no secrets. I wanted an open and honest relationship. Well, she married me anyway. I thank God for this wonderful second chance. That's us. Denise and I were devastated by divorce. Just don't want that thing to happen to anyone else if this unmasking will help. We've been married for 5 years, and we are doing life together now, side by side. All praise to God for His love, care, and healing grace. No doubt He can heal physical things and even addictions instantly if He wants to. but character and relationship healing takes time. And we have the promise in Philippians 1:6, being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. Hey, I still struggle with avoiding people and avoidance addiction big time, but I have a great network of CR friends to help me get through it. Denise is well aware of it too, and we talk through those situations that used to cause me to panic, shut down, and withdraw from reality. You know, when someone says, I don't want to talk about it, that was me all the time. Today I feel the Lord is fulfilling the promise in Joel 2:25 when he said, then I will make up to you for the years that the swarming locusts have eaten. Another very important part of successful recovery is step 12. Having had a spiritual experience as a result of these steps, we try to carry this message to others and to practice these principles in all of our affairs. Well, this is part of the go step from Cross Community, going out and sharing what God has done for you. In 2011, another praise team worship conference in Kansas City, I picked up and read John Baker's book, Life's Healing Choices, and realized that our church could benefit from a Celebrate Recovery program. During my separation and divorce, I felt no one in the church knew what to do with this. I think I assumed that since I was a long-standing minister, Bible teacher, and church leader, that the church figured I could get through it by myself. Well, that may be true, maybe not. But since being in recovery, God has demonstrated over and over that no one can make it through alone. We must have support to overcome. God began to give me a passion to not see anyone else in our church have to go through struggles alone, and instilled in me the idea that Celebrate Recovery would be a huge help to us church-type folk. It took a couple of years, but on a cold January night, some of us began to meet, pray, work through the step studies, and in order to begin CR in our church. 5 months later, in May of 2013, we opened the doors to Celebrate Recovery. We have a great growing team of leaders. It has been God's way for all of us to fulfill step 12, to give back. And God has done a great work in many lives thus far. I'm telling you, he never wastes a hurt. If you're interested in CR, be advised, no one in Celebrate Recovery can fix you. That's God's job. But even if, like me, you needed professional counseling help, CR can provide support, provide a safe place for you to share your hurts, habits, and hang-ups. A safe place to share not only these negative things, but also celebrate the victories you experience along the way. I believe our church staff has the hope of also seeing our home groups become safe, non-judgmental places to share struggles and receive support for emotional healing. I hope that you see through what I've shared that 12-step recovery is not just for the so-called hardcore addicts. All of us in this room have struggles that have kept us in lifelong bondage. Anger, shame, and hurts keep us from developing into the person and even the church God desires us to become. Listen, hurting people hurt people. It's just inevitable. Instead of turning to alcohol or drugs, many of us church folk find other ways to cope, such as overeating, work, sex, gambling, withdrawing, or even doing good churchy stuff. Yet we try to hide the real truth from fellow believers in order to fit in, look good, and be accepted. Let's remove the mask. Let's get real. We don't have to wallow in the pain and struggles of our hurts, habits, hang-ups, hypocrisies, and secrecies any longer. God has made provision for us to get help and is waiting on us to take the first step. Thank you for letting me share.